Hello, welcome to Module 3 of Applied Research Methods in Sports and Kinesiology, KINE 5301. In this module, we'll look at the research design in sports management. We'll look at it from the perspective of surveys and interviews. The topics that we will cover, again, are found in Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, which involves surveys and interviews, which are critical components of conducting research. When looking at Chapter 7 in surveys, there's certain objectives that we want to look at. First, we want to understand the purpose of survey research, understand the difference between a survey and a questionnaire, understand various interview types, understand various questionnaire types, understand different types of questions, understand the need and procedure for a pilot study. Our biblical foundation can be found in John, the 16th chapter, the 29th through the 31st verses, which read, "His disciples said, now you are speaking plainly and not using figurative speech. Now we know that you know all things and do not need anyone to question you. This is why we believe that you came from God." And Jesus answered them, saying, "Do you now believe?" And so with that scripture and that biblical foundation, we look at survey research. In the field of sports administration and sport marketing research, we find that it relies on survey research to reach mass target populations. Surveys allow sports researchers the ability to gain information about characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors of certain populations. Surveys are referring to the action of collecting information in a variety of ways that are different and can involve a multitude of functions to get that information. Survey research can be interviews, emails, or phone contacting, or many other things. When we look at questionnaires, we find that these refer to only one method of collecting data that involves asking a set of questions. These questions usually have a specific purpose, and if the research question can be addressed via a questionnaire, then it is likely to be the researcher's most efficient and cost-effective option. When we look at interview types, interviews allow researchers to incorporate a human element into the data collection process. Face-to-face interviews, one-on-one interviews, group or focus group interviews. Secondly, we look at phone interviews. Questionnaire types can be paper or hard copy questionnaires that have direct control when passed out by the researcher. We have mail questionnaires, which you usually get a low response rate. Sometimes you have internet questionnaires, which are given via a website, and this is very convenient and has a lower cost. And we also have email interviews or questionnaires. These are typically convenient, low cost, but no guarantee that the participant will receive it. So again, looking at the questionnaire types, we have the paper, hard copy, the mail questionnaires, the internet questionnaires, and the email questionnaires. Another important aspect as it relates to surveys is that there are open questions. These open questions allow the participant to respond in an unrestricted manner. They are often associated with qualitative studies and are most useful when the researcher is unsure of the unlikely, or at least of the likely responses. On the other hand, some surveys are closed questions. These require the respondent or the person who responds to the questionnaire or survey to choose from a number of predetermined responses. These are typically associated with quantitative studies. So qualitative studies dealing with open questions and quantitative studies typically dealing with closed questions. And they are used when the researcher has a clear idea of the available responses. Sometimes there are other questions that are neither open or closed. For example, you have the Likert scale, where the respondent indicates the extent to which he or she agrees or disagrees, usually by a number. You have the list question, where the respondent selects more than one response. Thirdly, you have ranking questions. This is where respondents rank responses in order of importance. And then you also have the filter question, which allows respondents to skip questions that may not apply to them. Pilot studies are involving a small-scale administration of the survey prior to the main administration, and is often conducted by using a similar but smaller sample. It allows the researcher to test the administration methods. Continuing our discussion on pilot studies, we find that it is used to test the research questions, to see if the research is clear, and to also further enhance the reliability and validity of the research instrument itself. As we shift from Chapter 7 and surveys, we now want to look at Chapter 8 and interviews. The objectives in this chapter are as follows. We seek to understand how to conduct research interviews, understand the appropriate interview techniques for particular research questions, understand the benefits of various interview techniques, understand the process of breaking down interview transcripts into similar codes and themes, understanding the importance of validating data. Our biblical foundation is found for Chapter 8 for interviews. It is found in Hebrews 2 verses 1 through 3, which reads, "Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who have heard." When looking at the interview process, we see that assessing the setting involves getting into the field, identifying where to conduct your interviews, and among what people groups. Secondly, understanding the language and culture of the respondents, which means to understand the language and the cultural influences surrounding your interview process. The interview process, while continuing to look at this component, we find that thirdly, the locating of an informant, meaning to identify an insider or a member of the group being studied who is willing to serve as an informant about the group and act as a guide. Fourthly, deciding how to present oneself. A researcher's self-presentation can be critical to breaking down or erecting barriers to data collection. Appearance, presentation, and emotion shown. Fifth, we look at the gaining of trust and establishing rapport. When doing an interview, it is very essential for the interviewers to establish and maintain trust and rapport between themselves and the respondents. Six, we look at the collection of data, where researchers can record interviewers via audio or video, or they can be written down and transcribed. Notes can also be taken regarding external influences surrounding the interview. So, interview techniques. As we continue our discussions in Chapter 8, we find that there are several interview techniques that are common in qualitative research. Each of them have their own advantages and disadvantages in terms of not only time, commitment, but ease of use and data gathering. Researchers should be meaningful and manageable. Very important components of interview. When looking at or conducting structured interviews, we have a set of pre-established questions that follow strict administration and scoring rules. There's little room allowed to open questions of variation. One strength is that it will allow the researcher to obtain a large amount of data in a short period of time. The researcher attempts to control the entire experience, including the following: the environment, the question order, and the wording of the questions themselves. One weakness could be the behavior of the interviewee in a controlled environment. So those things are very important as it relates to structured interviewing. On the other hand, we look at unstructured interviewing. It involves open-ended questions aimed at eliciting richer responses from interviews in a less formal approach. By doing this, we allow the conversation to take any and every direction. And this provides the researcher with new themes or trends that possibly had not even been identified or explored in the literature. Other interview methods include the phenomenological interviewing process, where one seeks to understand how the subjective world or social reality that we live in is constituted, how human beings make sense of their experiences and the world around them. Secondly, the group interviewing process, where there's systematic questioning of several individuals simultaneously. Thirdly, we look at the Delphi procedure, which questions individuals, then presents responses to a group of experts for their opinions. Next, after conducting the interviews, we want to then begin to code the data that has been collected. Coding is simply the act of moving from raw text to research concerns in small steps, each building on the previous one. Therefore, you can think of the steps of coding as kind of like a staircase where you move up from a lower to a higher level of understanding. After coding our data, we must then validate the data that has been collected. Qualitative researchers often consider whether the data are validated, that is, whether the data adequately represented what they saw or they heard. Member checking, which is a process wherein the researcher provides participants with transcripts of their interviews to ensure that what the researcher recorded is, in fact, what the participant was saying. So this validation of data step is very important. So, having looked at Chapter 7, surveys, as well as Chapter 8 on interviews, considering our biblical foundation and what we're attempting to do, the question now becomes, what's next? Complete your detailed reading is very important, as well as, again, answering the discussion questions, completing the writing assignments, as well as continued participation in the course. This concludes Module 3.